All right. Next step here is we've created all 5 of the grid styles, and now we're going to copy our artboards because we want to start really exploring how to take this and combine and change and create new iterations. Because ultimately we're going to be creating quite a few different ones, but it's helpful to copy what we've done so we can kind of start using them and combining them. And of course we can add to them. So let me walk you through this. So what you want to do is start off with unlock all of your layers. And you can see we have 5 artboards and we have 5 layers. So we want to take our selection tool and select all 5 artboards and layers. And so I have these both open so I can see all my layers are selected by these little squares on the right side. That shows me all of the layers are selected, and all the artboards are highlighted. So now with our selection tool kind of floating in the middle of one of the artboards, I'm not clicking anything yet. I'm now going to hold my Option key down and I'm going to click, undo. I'm going to select everything, hold the Option key down where you can see when I'm over the artboard, you can see 2 arrows. Highlight. I'm going to click and drag. Now I'm going to grab my other finger and hold the Shift key down to kind of keep them aligned. And I want to eyeball it and give them about the same amount of space. We want to have about an artboard's worth of space between our rows. So you're going to eyeball it. And I'm going to let go, and I have another row. If I look here on my, hold on, I don't think the artboards moved, did they? Maybe just hold on a minute. Select. All of my artboards were needed to be selected. Hold on a second. Shift key, I'm holding my Shift key down. I'm selecting everything. All of my artboards are selected. All of my art is selected. You know what? You need to be in the artboard mode. Now I'm going to hold the Option key down and pull it down. Hold the Shift key down. And I can see my artboards are now copied. You need to see that you have copied the artboards here in the artboard menu. So I can adjust where I have them, holding the Shift key down and adjusting them, but that, I want to go a little, I want to take these artboards and adjust their location. I can do that. Again, I need to be in the artboard mode, hold my Shift key down, and I can adjust come on. I can move them down with my arrow keys, and I don't want to add another artboard. I just want to move them. There we go. So that's where this is. So now I have copies. And I can keep doing that, going down. Here's my overall size of everything. I can go upward, I can take and say, I'm going to hold my selection key again, select everything. Artboard. Hold my Option key down. Option. Why is it only grabbing one? Hold on a minute. Grab everybody. All the artboards need to be selected. I'm in the artboard. Option. It's a little tricky, but we can get it. How are we doing? Is everyone getting that?
For me, it's just like, it's not copying the artwork, it's just copying the blank artboards.
You have to have the artwork selected. You have to make sure you've unlocked your layers and that you've used your selection tool to select both the artwork and the artboards.
Okay.
Are your layers locked?
No. Oops. They're unlocked. I think I just didn't have it selected.
Okay, try it again. Just try it again. See if you can get it. And again, remember, you can undo anything you've done.
Okay, it's still just copying the artboards. Like I have the artboards and the layers selected.
Okay. So we are now looking at, we've made a few copies to start with. We know how to make copies now. We want to start combining. So we want to look at things like, I'm going to start on my second row here. Like we have this square grid and we have a polar grid. What would it look like if we took our polar grid here and I copied it, Command C, and come over here to my square grid, Command V, and then use my alignment tool. Oops, I didn't select my artboard. Select my artboard and align it here. And so now I have a new grid that I can then look at and decide, you know, what do I want to do? So a few practical tips, because, you know, we have everything on layers. We have each of our designs on layers. So now I've just made a combination here. So what I want to do is take them off the layers they're currently on and move these two elements to their own layer. So let's keep things organized as we start working in combining our grids. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to move these two elements by clicking on the little white squares here onto their respective new layer. So I'm putting these both on this layer, and I'm not going to keep it labeled layer whatever number. I'm going to label it. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give myself, you can give yourself a code of how you want to organize layering names. So I'm going to do a square, SQ for square, slash P for polar. I'm going to call it P1 or PI because it's an irregular polar. So that's my little symbol, and I can then also number them. Like I could say this is my first one of these. And so these are now, you can see that they're all on one layer. You can see they're on the turquoise layer, it's labeled. And see, this is artboard copy 1. I can also rename the artboard again to keep myself organized, because ultimately I'm going to have 40. So I'm just going to rename this 6, artboard 6, because it's in the second row. So for example, this row is 5, and then I'm going to start here at 6, and I'm going to make this next one 7. So I'm going to try to keep myself organized so I can know where things are easily on my document. I highly encourage you to do this and to think about the way you're going to organize your work, because this is where it can get very confusing. You just kind of haphazardly put things around, you know, throw things around and don't label anything. You're going to real struggle as we get further along in this process, because you're not going to know where anything is. So I really recommend not doing that. So, okay, so here we are. I have my polar elements. And actually what I'm going to, yeah. And I might even think about like, okay, so I have these different polar elements. One of the things I realized I didn't do with my polar is turning them into separate elements. Right now, you can see my squares are all separate elements that I can select. I'm going to just take a second and move my square off my grid so I can access my polar for a minute. I'm just going to move that over. And here's my polar grid. I'm going to select my whole polar grid, and I'm going to go over to my Pathfinder, and I'm going to outline it so that each one of these modulars is separate. And that's going to help me as I want to edit and change things. So now I have each one of these separate. And so then I can look at it and decide, do I want to keep everything that I have here? Because it's going to get pretty busy. So I'm going to pull the square over again. And now look at it. And so now I can go through my design and decide what elements and lines do I want to keep and what ones do I want to get rid of. And also, do I want to keep everything the same scale? So first of all, I'm looking at it and, my circle elements aren't lining up great with my square. So I want to change the scale of this to make them line up better with my square grid. So I've selected my polar. I'm going to use the, not the rotate, the scale tool. And I'm going to put my anchor right in the center. I'm going to hold my shift key down and I'm going to scale up. Actually, I'm not going to hold my shift key down because I want to do it manually because I want to look at where the intersections are and see about scaling up this radial so that it's working with my design better. And I realize, like, where are the lines aligning that's going to make sense for my design. Oops, I'm holding the shift key so I can get it a little bit, I want to keep it radial. So I'm holding the shift key, but I want to get it aligning with the lines in a way that makes sense to me. Okay, I'm liking that better. So now I have my radial there. Now it doesn't have to also be centered. I can also think about taking my radial and let's put it in a corner. What does that do? And I'm going to use the scale tool again and adjust it and think about, where do I want to, how do I want to align this? With the square. Maybe I just want it to be coming on one side. And how do I like that idea? Maybe I want to see it and I'm going to duplicate it and come back with, hold the option, shift. Oops, I don't want both. I just want to take one option key, holding my option key down and pull it into the other corner. What does that look like? So there's lots of ways you can start playing. Scale is really an important one to think about. And then once I have this, I can decide how much of the elements I want to keep. So exactly when I'm going in with my design, I can say, do I like how this is, where things are landing, how things are intersecting, and decide what elements I want to keep or take. So that's the first step, is kind of start playing with these combinations. Make sure you're labeling them. So I want you to, we're going to look at kind of these combinations. How do we want to combine things? And then I might look at it and say, you know what, I don't see, maybe I do want to see it. Maybe I do like it more centered. Maybe I go back to that centering on this one as I'm playing with it. Or I decide, you know what, this radial isn't quite right for this square. Maybe I want to combine this radial with, a different one. But, there's lots of ways to look at it. Don't look at all the different ways. I can keep scaling it, adjusting that scale, adjusting the placement. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. So as we're thinking about this, I'm going to move over to presenting this to kind of give you a little bit of some examples. So I'm just going to share it this way because I think it'll be helpful to see. You can overlap grids. We could do 2 square grids on top of each other. We can double the scale. We can rotate the second grid. You know how to use the rotate tool. Bring it in at a 45. Play with rotation. Play with scale. And looking at different elements of how they're going to combine polar grids and square grids, working on playing with each one as you go across your screen. Looking at the corners, moving those polar grids into the corners. The reason we're pulling them so far apart is for that ability to really play with scale, which can help us really understand. And sometimes though, so here's an example of polar grids and looking at, what does it look like with two polar grids on either side, or put the center of the polar grids in the corners, or maybe it's in all four corners, or maybe there's two polar grids intersecting each other with a square grid. So there's lots of different ways to combine these things. We can take polar grids and ultimately take bits and pieces out of them and turn them into other elements. The idea is we can use as many elements as we need when constructing our custom grids, but remember we want to remove extraneous elements, because as you can see on the left example here, it can get really crazy like a spider web, and we're going to need to take out elements to make it more useful, like you see in the one on the right. Here's another example of an overcomplicated grid. So recognizing, for example, maybe using a polar grid without the rays. So this is an example of two polar grids without the rays and a square grid combined. And on the right, you can see it's a square grid with two polar grids with the rays. So you can make a polar grid without the rays, and especially when you're layering, you probably want to, because look at the difference. I mean, it'd be very hard to work with the one on the right, much easier to work with the one on the left. So think about that with the polar grid. You can take out the rays and not use the rays. As we get going, we can also think about adding squares, rectangles, diamonds, circles, ellipses, polygons, triangles, pentagons, hexagons to add to our grids to help add the customization to them. And when we're developing our custom grid, we're going to use things like minus front, intersect, and divide pathfinder options to create custom shapes and to simplify our grid by removing unnecessary lines. And when we're thinking about cleaning up our grids, simplifying our grids, we can use Pathfinder. We can also use the Shape Builder tool. Both can work in very simple ways to create custom shapes which have geometric properties. We can remove unnecessary lines, which is what we're going to want to do, and make our grids as neat and usable as possible. Here's some examples of ultimately the designs that are created from these combination grids, which we'll be doing in our next step. Right now, we're just making the grids. We're not worrying about the shapes that we're going to build out of it. We just want to have clean grids that we can build on top of. Things like repeating patterns can happen. Standalone elements can happen. Isometric designs. Things filled in, things that are just lines colored. So for example, the rays making the divisions of color, the radials, all the same size, breaking up the rings. And so we're going to be thinking about elements that we're going to use on our designs, how we're going to space elements, repeating edges if we're going to make patterns, formal uses like full format, centered, asymmetrical. We're going to be looking at balance. We're going to be looking at emphasis. We're going to be looking at movement. These are all things we're going to be looking towards when we get into building our shapes. So this is where we're going. So I want to give you a little glimpse in where we're going, because this is the foundation over here where we're building these grids. This is the foundation of where we're going to go to get to end results like this. All right, so now it's your turn to start building your grids, and you're going to be building grids that are using all the 5 grid types you've learned, and now you're going to be exploring different versions of those original 5 plus combinations. and seeing where you can go. So let me share one more thing with you before I send you off on your design direction. And that is, let me pull up my notes here. All this in here so you can see it. So we are going to be combining our standard grids now that we know the basics. And so now we're going to really like explore. We've copied our artboards so that we we can make more grids on the artboards. We're going to keep using a separate layer for each grid. So that's one of the rules. You want to make sure you use a separate layer for each grid. So as you saw me combining them and moving my grids from the layers they're on, because when you're copying them, they're just copying within those layers. We want to move them as we combine them into their own layers. When you create a second grid on top of an existing grid, you want to, when you're using like the rectangular tool or the polar grid to manually draw a new grid, decide whether to draw your grid is from the corner or from the center, holding down your Alt key. You can also make sure to use smart guides to place those points of your grid. That's why we have the smart guides on, to really help you kind of pinpoint accurately where you're putting the grid. Also, you can adjust the having raise or the skew value. Having your bits fall outside the artboard is fine. Once you have the grid designed how you want it, we're going to do it, take all those outside bits off by the same way, by outlining in Pathfinder and then deleting all the edges. So you have a clean square grid when you're done. So, but as you're working, obviously you're going to have bits coming off until you get it where you want it. So really experiment. This is where play comes in. This is now an opportunity for you to play, experiment, learn, work with all these new tools you're just learning and using, and see how many different variations you can come up with. So I have examples here. My advice is to not just take these first 5 and use these first 500 different ways. Make more of the squares, make more irregular squares, make more polar grids, different polar grids, different configurations of units, the isometric and the hexagon. So make sure you rename your layers, and after you've finished one, lock them. So the key here to success is being organized. And this is a great time for you to work on, if that's not your strong point, this is a great time to work on organizing and staying organized so that you can have a better time of it, because we're going to be doing lots of different things to these grids. These are just the foundational element. We're going to be building on top of these. So you want to have a real organized set to start with. And so I can't emphasize enough staying organized, because it can get really confusing very quickly if you don't stay organized. All right, so let me stop sharing, and I'm going to open it up for questions.